Making a movie is a challenging enough affair, but making a Superman movie is a challenging affair all of its own. There's so many elements you have to get right. And unfortunately, since Superman the movie, we haven't had that full package as we did in Superman the movie. Richard Donner and Mankiewicz, Tom Mankiewicz, the guy who wrote Superman the movie, and Richard Donner, who directed it, spoke about the two kids on a date scenario. They spoke about the love story. If you make the love story work, they said, you make the entire movie work. Otherwise, it looks like a neat trailer, but it isn't a very good movie. The romance between Lois, Clark, and Superman is one of the most famous love stories in the history of storytelling and fiction, comics, television, and film. And its most famous depiction in live action is certainly Superman the movie. That's where they really got it right. But Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, the show starring Terry Hatcher and Dean Cain, got it right. For 4 seasons, people were watching that show just for that love story. They got the Lois and Clark love story right in Smallville. And then they created a little show called Superman and Lois. But this time, they've already met. They're married. They have 2 boys. One has powers, one doesn't. It's a very interesting new way to go at the relationship of Superman, Clark, and Lois. And in Man of Steel, they kind of had the attitude of, let's just get this love story out the work and get on with the fun stuff. That's how I see Man of Steel. But it's clear to me that James Gunn will put the relationship between Superman, Clark, and Lois in the central point of Superman Legacy. And how does he actually go about doing that? Well, first he has to ask the question, who is Lois Lane? As a young boy, I loved the fact that Lois Lane was strong, impactful, independent, and spoke her mind. And she's a very cynical character, especially in Superman the movie. The scene that I loved the best is on the balcony. No, I'm not talking about the romantic flying sequence, which really sets the movie up as a romantic movie, and the love story, right, which makes the entire movie work. It's the moment when he tells Lois, Superman tells Lois, I'm here to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. She responds cynically, you're going to fight every elected official. I'm sure you don't mean that, Lois. Because Superman really believes in that America is a good place and those ideals should be fought for. Because he comes from a little country town called Smallville. So he's not a cynical person, but she's a big city gal. And she is cynical. And that's one of the great aesthetics of who she is. But that's the first question James Gunn has to ask. He has to ask, who is Lois Lane? She's a strong, independent, cynical person. Perfect as a woman in the 21st century, if she is going to be a 21st century Lois Lane. You've got to be very careful with Lois Lane. Lois isn't a feminist. No, certainly not a third wave feminist. She's not. Lois gets up in the morning to be a reporter, to expose people like Lex Luthor and the authority and big business and people trying to trample on the little person. Basically, she's as much of a hero as Clark and Superman is. And that's who Lois Lane is. She cares. Lois cares. That's why I love her. She cares about the world she lives in. She doesn't just care about women. She cares about women. She cares about men. She cares about everyone. And she ain't a gal's gal. If anything, she's the kind of gal who's going to turn up to the prom with trousers on and a jumper. Because that's who she is. She doesn't care about that shit. She cares about being a reporter. She cares about justice as much as Superman does. That's the whole point of her. So when you ask who Lois Lane is, James, that's who Lois Lane is. And I think it's important to get that romantic story right between Superman, Clark, and Lois. You have to ask who Lois Lane is. But it's not just as easy and straightforward as it was for Richard Donner and Tom Mankiewicz to make the love story work so the film works. Regrettably, we live in very polarizing times, and straight relationships between a white man and a white woman are deemed very offensive by the far left, not only in Hollywood, but the people on social media. So you have to be careful how you frame this love story. It was a bit like telling a Joker story about a mentally ill man. They all of a sudden automatically assume you're making excuses for that man. That's not what Todd was attempting to do. $1 billion in the bank, the extremists were basically zipped up for good. So we do live in polarizing times, but you've got to put that to bed. The question is, can James Gunn write romance? Has he ever written romance before? I'm not sure. There's not really any romance in the Suicide Squad. Obviously, we do have a romantic story going through the Guardians of the Galaxy, trilogy, but in the end, they're not together. That's interesting, isn't it? Are they better off alone? Is that what he's going to attempt to do? Well, I don't know if he'll have Superman and Lois or Clark and Lois or Lois and Clark, however you like to frame them, as a couple. We did see that in the Snyderverse. So maybe that won't be a thing, but the playfulness, the two kids on a date, I absolutely, certainly expect to see that. But as I say, can James Gunn do it? This is the most vital element of the movie because it's a balancing act. You've got to represent Lois as an independent, strong woman, but a woman who can love Superman. Because what woman doesn't look up at a god and say, wow, a god that doesn't use his power to dominate and kill and maintain and make people intimidated and scared, but uses it for love, to catch us before we fall? What woman wouldn't want that? Well, there is some that wouldn't. There's some women who despise men in any form. As I say, we live in very polarizing times. But as I say, you've got to ignore the nutters and the extremists and make your movie at the end of the day. So it will be interesting if James Gunn is able to pull off this situation of this is one of the most famous love stories in fiction, as I've already mentioned. So people will be looking at the relationship between Clark and Lois and Lois in Superman the movie. Now, some people have criticised Margot's Lois Lane for being in love with the myth, the god, and not the person. And I suppose you can look at it and kind of say, well, that's kind of true. But for me, it works. It works in so many elements. As I say, it's, this god turns up and she falls in love with him. And I suppose she falls in love with the idea of him. There's an interesting line of dialogue. When Lois, in the bar, in the restaurant place, when Clark's getting the shit kicked out of him, and Lois goes, I just want the man I fell in love with. And Clark says very aptly, I wish he were here. So that's interesting, isn't it? Even Clark can see that it's not Clark Kent she's in love with, but she's actually in love with Superman. Or was she? Anyway, they pulled off the love story. The main reason at the end of the movie, when Superman's screaming to the heavens when Lois Lane is dead, the reason that's such a powerful moment, because of the build-up, they got the relationship right. So you need the chemistry between both actors. A lot of people say that Henry Cavill and Amy Adams didn't have any chemistry. That is not true. The problem in Man of Steel in that relationship is you've got two very good actors that are not given a space to construct a great love story because they don't want the love story to be the central point. As I said, they just want to get it out the way. It's not in their interest. It's not what they want to focus the film on because they don't think two kids on a date is very interesting. So James Gunn has a very interesting balancing act here. He has to create the two kids on a date movie, but he has to have a lot of action. He has to have a lot of, he has to have a gee whiz quality. He needs action. He can't do what Superman Returns did, which is have very little action. And basically, they messed the relationship between Clark and Superman and Lois up in that film because she's with Richard Wyatt. So people who say about Brandon Superman, he's a stalker. Well, he may look like a stalker, but he's just heartbroken. The woman, the only woman, well, not the only woman he's ever loved, obviously. He loved Lana when he was in Smallville. But, in his adult life, the woman he's supposed to be with has just gone off with somebody else. A substitute who can also fly, but in a plane. Look, it's a very weird story, and they messed it up. And the whole film is about that. It's about if Superman can be relevant to Lois Lane again and to the world. It just wasn't executed maybe in the right way. I still enjoy watching Superman Returns, by the way. So what James Gunn has to do here is create a balancing act where you've got this love story, making it work, but having lots of action and lots of gee whiz and lots of comic book stuff, and setting up this interconnected universe as well. I'm sure James is capable of doing most of that stuff, but one of the key elements I think he's already pulled off is the casting of Clark, Superman, and Lois Lane. Basically, the actors cast in these roles, in these iconic roles, are iconic themselves and very humble people, and they will get to work already in their performances. They will already have their scripts. They'll be studying it. They'll be working together. They've already had some chemistry tests. I think these two will work very, very well on screen. And believe you me, James Gunn has already teased through some comic book panels that, from All-Star Superman, that he really wants to focus on this relationship, and that's a very, very good idea. Is James Gunn a romantic person? I don't know. We'll have to ask his wife. Oi, Jen, is he romantic? Does he buy you flowers on Valentine's Day? Does he wine and dine you? Jen, I want to know. Anyway, so we're going to find out what he's like at writing a love story. As we saw, we saw it with Star-Lord and Gamora. In the first film, it was very, very interesting and lightly done, but we did live in slightly less polarizing times. So by the third movie, they're not even, well, you know what happens in the third movie. So you could call that interesting, you could call it an anticlimax, but not all love stories end up happily ever after. But here's the thing. The extremists in Hollywood don't like happily ever after. And I've always been opposed to it. I've always been one of these people who thinks two people kissing at an end of the movie or at the end of the story isn't necessarily a happily ever after. And if you're someone who can't get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, it kind of makes you think, well, I'm never going to get that happily ever after. I don't know. As I say, we do live in very polarizing times and everyone wants to be represented, not just cultures and genders and, the LGBTQ community, but people who may not be as attractive as others, who can't have a partner or haven't got the confidence to go out there and find their happily ever after. But James Gunn can only make his movie. At the end of the day, Superman and Lois Lane are two, heroes. Lois Lane is a great journalist. Yes, Lois Lane has always been an attractive woman, but that isn't the point with Lois. By the way, can I just say something? Some idiot on Twitter posted a picture of Rachel making fun of her nose. You are not a DC fan. You are not a Superman fan. I suspect you're one of the loudmouth Snyderverse stans, and I know some lovely Snyderverse stans. In fact, I love the Snyderverse myself. How dare you? That's how people get depressed. That's how people self-harm. That's how people end their lives. I don't want to see that shit again. And if anyone watching this video has ever attacked Rachel Brosnahan or anyone else for their looks, go away from my platform now. That's not what we're about here on Movies TV Mad. Yes, we're about passion. Well, sometimes I can be very passionate and angry about people, but we don't talk about people's appearances. We don't bully people just because Amy Adams isn't Lois Lane anymore. We don't do that. You are disgusting while you're hiding behind a picture that isn't yours. Aren't you brave? Stop it. Stop it now. Leave Rachel alone. If you want to keep on criticizing James Gunn for his creative decisions, fine. If you want to be angry that he fired Henry Cavill, fine. Don't attack what people look like. Don't attack women. Be a gentleman. Hold the door open. Call her ma'am, me lady. I know they find that offensive these days, but you know what I mean. Be a gentleman. Don't make fun of the woman's nose. She's got a beautiful nose. She's beautiful. But none of that matters. Even if she was covered in spots and she was playing Lois Lane, it wouldn't matter. How dare you? And that's the end of my rant. So James Gunn was always going to have a huge challenge with this movie. And there's no question about that. But getting the romantic relationship right between Lois and Clark and Superman is a huge challenge, especially in these polarizing times. And, you know, as I said, Superman the movie was bang on, it worked. But we have to understand, we live in very different times. If we go back to the first Iron Man, now we do see a romance developing between Pepper and Tony, but it's not done old school romantically. We see the relationship between what's her face and Thor. I forgot her name, Jane and Thor, right? And again, it's not really done in the old-fashioned way. You know, she's a kind of astronomer. You know, she discovers him. It's okay, it's done okay, right? But in a lot of ways, there's only one way you can go at Lois, Clark and Superman. Because, as I said earlier, you have to make sure that Lois is independent, strong, but not a bitch. Because I think there's sections of the Superman comics media where Lois Lane became like this ultra-feminist, a bit of a bitch, and someone that Superman would never fall in love with, because Superman doesn't like rude, arrogant, hateful people. So you could have a big problem there. Like, we need to like Lois. You know, let me be clear here. I ain't got any problem with strong, independent women. I shouldn't have to say this, right? I also don't have a problem with women who are a little bit shy, who are not independent and, you know, are not out of their shell, and that's their personality. I think that Hollywood needs to represent different personalities. Strong men, shy men with no confidence, strong women, shy women with no confidence. I think they're all part of this earth, right? They all deserve to be represented. Not all women are go-getters and not all men are strong alpha males. And that's okay. But when you try and represent all women as alphas and all men as betas, you got a bit of a problem. And that's why people ain't coming to your movies anymore. The truth is, whether a man or a woman's a go-getter or not, it shouldn't really matter. It's what's in here that always truly matters. The great women and male characterizations that we've fallen in love with. You know, Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman, someone who begins as a prostitute, and again, there's nothing wrong with being a prostitute, but then she evolves into somebody else. And, you know, character evolution is always very, very important. In a way, when we first meet Lois Lane, and I don't know how we'll meet her in Superman Legacy, I have a lot of ideas myself, but in the opening kind of sequence we see her at, I'd like to see her in like Beirut or the Middle East, and she's with, you know, and she's with Jimmy Olsen, and she's dragged him in the Middle East. There's shooting and shit going, and they're trying to run for cover and take pictures, because that displays Jimmy and Lois's relationship already, and that she's a very brave, independent woman without being a nasty, horrible, man-hating woman. As I say, there's a balancing act here. I've always been fascinated by Lois Lane as much as I've loved Superman and Clark. I've been, because, you know, my parents were immigrants. I was racially abused, right? I didn't fit in like Clark didn't in Smallville as a kid. Am I a Kryptonian? Am I American? Am I from Kansas? What the fuck am I? Where do I belong? That's how I felt as a kid. When we used to come on holiday here in Cyprus, where my parents are from, oh my God, you're a Charlie boy, you're an English boy, piss off. Right, when I went to England, I was called a P-A-K-I, as I explained the other day. So in the end, I said, fuck nationality, I'm a human being, I don't want to belong to any fucking flag. That was my attitude. Because as a kid, your brain is a sponge, you soak in the hatred. And then you just say, you reject everyone, and you reject everything. So that's why I always loved Superman, or one of the reasons I loved Superman. The powers, the costume, the flying, you know, the fact that he's a really good person, that's something I really aspire to be. And when I do a bad thing, or I have a bad fault, even when I see a woman in the street and when she walks past and can't see me, I think, wouldn't mind some of that. I think, oh my God, Superman or Clark would never do that. And I start to feel guilty. I don't know if any other Superman fans like that. But I've always been fascinated by Lois Lane because there's been, I think in most of her live action turns, she's been represented so well. You know, meanwhile, women are not being represented very well by feminist Hollywood right now because they're being painted as nasty, rude, obnoxious people. You can be strong, but still be a lovely, caring, compassionate woman. I wish I could write for women in Hollywood. I really do. I know only women are supposed to write for women these days, but you know what? I've spent my life with so many women. Most of my friends are women, so I don't know what it's like to be a woman, but I'd certainly love to sit there with my women friends and jot some stuff down and write a really great female character based on all the women I've met. But I've always loved Lois. For Lois, right? So just because she's in love with Superman and Clark, it doesn't make her a weak woman. We can still have that romantic relationship. And I think it's important that we make her strong, we make her independent, we make her this compassionate, passionate journalist that goes after the bad people, right, through being a great journalist and being brave to go to places like the Middle East, Beirut, Lebanon, wherever, right? And drag Jimmy Olsen with her. You know, I want to see that, but I also want to see Lois Lane be a woman that Superman can love. So it's a very challenging situation for James Gunn. And as I say, as a kid, Superman the movie being the first movie I ever saw and basically my introduction to Superman and Lois, it was very interesting. That first movie was about the love story. The center point of that movie is the love story between Clark and Lois, although Lois and Clark, you know, it's interesting because Superman the movie really depicts the relationship between Superman, the romance between Superman and Lois, not really Clark and Lois. Now, Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, makes Superman the secondary character. And Clark is the main character, and he's the one who actually has the relationship with Lois Lane. Same with Smallville. When they first meet, they're annoyed by each other. I love that aspect, Alan, actually. So we go through seasons 4, 5, 6, and 7. They start to slightly fall in love as Clark and Lana's relationship starts to break down. And from season 8 to 10, we get that proper relationship between Clark, the Blur, and Lois Lane. And it's brilliantly done. It really is. And I tell you what, no disrespect to Tom Welling, the reason that works so much, the writing's great, but Erica's performances, she's such a strong actor. And it's because of the acting game, the acting business being so competitive. But I can't understand why that woman isn't pretty much in everything. She's such an amazing actor. And she's definitely one of my, if not my favourite, Lois Lane. But I think they're all great. I think they're absolute, you know, brilliant. And, you know, when you look at Lizzie Tulloch as well on Superman and Lois, especially this season with the cancer and everything, it's been absolutely so powerful and she's been great. But Lois Lane has always been the most important part of Superman, the most important part, more important than Lex or any of the villains. So in the series season 3 finale of Superman and Lois, we see Doomsday dragging up Superman. He's weak. He's going to die. He starts thinking about Lois and his boys. That gives him the strength to basically grab Doomsday, take his arm off and push him. Lois Lane has always given Superman and Clark inner strength. And once you execute that in the right way, you've got a very powerful, beautiful kind of, you know, romance. Great storyline. I do believe that James Gunn is going to make that relationship the central point. But as I said earlier, it's a big challenge, everyone. But it's a challenge I know that James Gunn will meet head on. It's not really a challenge he's had before. Because here's the thing. Star-Lord and Gamora, yes, they're comic book characters, but they're not famous comic book characters. Clark, Superman, and Lois are fucking icons. And Donna and Mank got it right in Superman the movie. It's not that they got it wrong in Man of Steel, they just weren't interested in making that relationship the focus. It's a new take on the same material. They're in love, they're together, sometimes they get some very strong scenes together, but it isn't the central point. But I think the relationship between Clark, Superman, and Lois needs to be the central point. I want to see, the banter between Lois and Clark at the Daily Planet. That's something we haven't even catalogued. It was catalogued in Superman the movie. It was catalogued even in Smallville. Where before Lois knows who Clark is, they're having the banter in season 8 that we saw in Superman the movie and Lois and Clark. So that banter in the Daily Planet between Lois and Clark is very, very important. And it builds up that romance, and very, very interestingly as well. So that's another aspect that I didn't even think about, or I forgot about, how dare I, because it's very important, that James Gunn is going to need to establish. And none of this is easy. It's very, very difficult to find the right way to go at a romantic relationship, because straight relationships are on the dock today. In fact, you won't see many straight romantic relationships depicted in television, animation, or movies today. It's not the thing. Nobody should be in love. What happened with Wednesday? They were going to have a love triangle. Now, they're already talking about next season, going with the horror moments and not focusing on romance. Straight relationships are an ugly word to extreme left Hollywood. But I tell you what, if Wednesday decided to have, a same-sex relationship between Wednesday and another girl, they'd be all for romance then, wouldn't they? I absolutely love everyone. I want gay people and trans people to fall in love with the people they want to fall in love with. But I want the right, as a straight person, to celebrate straight love as well. And you shouldn't be saying to me, well, we've had so many straight relationships, it's time for the gay ones. No, it's time for everything. That's what a peaceful world is. But everyone's so angry. Lois and Clark, Lois and Superman is iconic. It's Romeo and Juliet. It's Marion and Robin of Locksley, right? It's that iconic. And people deserve to see it done in the right way. It's a challenge for sure for James Gunn, but as I say, it's one I believe he can meet head on. Being a straight man himself and being in love with Jen and being married with Jen, they look like a very in-love couple, so maybe Jen can help him with the romantic side of that storytelling. They seem a really nice couple. I know people get upset because Jen seems to appear in all his movies, or not all his movies, but some of his stuff, but that's only natural that she appears in his stuff. I said it before, if I had a sister or a niece or a friend or a wife who was in the industry and I was an influential producer, director, writer, why wouldn't I put her in my movie? I don't find that offensive. And actually, I'm sorry, hot take, and it shouldn't be a hot take, I actually think Jen is very, very solid. I think she's one of the big performers in Peacemaker. I thought she was great in the smaller roles she had in Suicide Squad. You can hate me, you can unsubscribe. I am not being a James Gunn shill. I am being honest. You know that I've criticised James when I felt the need to criticise James. That will be less and less now as we get to the build-up to Superman Legacy. I want to support James. I want to support his vision as a Superman fan and a passionate DC fan. I want to wait to see what he gives us. If I don't like it, I will say so constructively, as I've said many times. And if I love it, it's not because I'm a shill, it's because I love what I see. You know me. You know I'm a straight shooter. You know I'm going to tell you what I think. Yesterday on Twitter, I argued with, what's his name? I forgot his name now. The guy who plays Barry Allen's dad in The Flash, the guy who played the original Flash, right? I think his name's John. I forgot his other names, right? Argued with him, ended up muting him. Had an argument with the director Scott Derrickson, who directed the first Doctor Strange, because he was saying he didn't like the Chronicles of Narnia. And, he was bragging about, this new director, this new female Barbie director, Greta Gerwig, who's going to be writing and directing both movies. I said, don't worry, Scott. She's going to rewrite history for you. Because all of a sudden, Greta Gerwig is this overrated female director. She did the Little Women reboot, which is nowhere near the quality of the original one with Susan Sarandon, by the way. And she's been overrated as a great. And all of a sudden, like they did with Patty Jenkins, they're going to give her everything. She's obviously a feminist, working with Margot Robbie as well. We know that Barbie is a feminist movie. And he got upset with me. I don't like falling out with my Hollywood heroes. I get carried away. I'm very passionate about movies, art, television, and storytelling. And when I see it treated in the way it is now, when I see titans of industry replaced by activists who haven't got that ability to create something beautiful and exciting, we've lost the element of escapism. People come home from work and school, they're fed up of the world they live in, and they need an escape. The activists in Hollywood and in the UK have taken that element away from them. So now it's all about forcing your face in reality and the real world. That's why more and more people are self-harming, feeling depressed, and tragically ending their lives, because there's no more escapism anymore. And that's a tragedy. So hopefully with Superman Legacy, we go back to some beautiful, romantic, gee whiz escapism.